Hey guys, welcome to episode 9 and part 2 of the Chris Avellone interview. Let's get into it. When I spoke with Jason Bergman, he mentioned that the second battle of Hoover Dam wasn't as epic as it appeared on paper. I asked Chris if there were any memorable differences between the concept of the endgame battle and its final implementation. Jason is correct. In fact, we were repairing Hoover Dams, along with other areas' performance for much of the DLC development too, and we had to keep chipping away at geometry piece by piece until we were afraid the endgame, already on a shoestring budget polygon-wise, would break, or more correctly, break more. This was a little frustrating because when designing the DLCs, I'd specifically asked for memory space to be reserved for the DLC areas, and suddenly it seemed to vanish. So, instead of anticipating a problem and addressing it, the problem simply became more of a challenge with each DLC, and we had to do more limiting of their area space than previously expected to compensate. Still, it's what happens when project vision collides with level design reality, unfortunately, and the same thing happened with the city of New Vegas itself. In fact, performance concerns are the reasons it's built as it is and has been called empty. For me, seeing the city surrounded by giant billboards was a disappointment in the face to the open world concept, but again, it's what happens when the reality of polygon management meeting design of a city doesn't work in tandem, to the point of breaking the game or slowing the engine to a crawl. We eventually appointed a lead level designer to help address these issues, but it was late in development, and much of the problems were already present in several areas. It would have made more sense had we had a design hierarchy established earlier, and placed someone in that role to proactively enforce performance standards per area. The lead level designer, Charlie Staples, did a great job with this, and I had the good fortune to continue to be able to work with him on the DLCs. Charlie's great. New Vegas' DLCs were developed in an incredibly short amount of time, which makes their quality all the more impressive. The way they explore different themes while building a cohesive storyline that culminates with Lonesome Road was masterful to me, and that's not even considering the budget/time restraints or the 10,000 line dialogue limit. So I asked Chris about the challenges of creating the DLCs. It was more than a short amount of time. It was the sheer amount of time spent fixing the core game's many problems as a result of overscoping. It was proof positive you can't hold off paying the piper forever, and the longer you wait, the worse it gets. However, the only aspect of this is the people who had chosen to step over the scope line largely didn't have to deal with the consequences, and to be frank, were even irritated that the Plan 4 DLC was interfering with all the fixes they now needed for the core game. That said, you swallow, nod, and let it ride, and hope it doesn't happen again. At the end of the day, the core game should have been released in a better state, and we had no one to blame but ourselves. The problem is if it does happen again, and it did, repeatedly, often it took 2 or more DLCs or expansion packs before the core title felt like a core title, and that's too long for customers who have shelled out money to play a finished game. I should, however, count it lucky. Sometimes a game can get released so early, New Vegas and Pillars 2, where any extra time wouldn't have helped the title because of the sheer number of bugs. Even an extra month, 2 months, or more wouldn't have put a dent in them enough to change public opinion.
Begin again in the night. Let's sway again tonight.
Begin Again is haunting, and it really nails the atmosphere of the Sierra Madre. I knew Chris wrote the lyrics, but I was curious about the process behind the song and its recording. Mikey Dowling and Justin Bell and Stephanie DeBrule, who sang it, she was one of our artists, were the champions for making the song what it was. Mikey did adapt some of the lyrics from elements I'd written, but he and the crew are to be thanked for the song. All three did a great job, and it wasn't something they had to do. They just wanted to do it, so they did. We had a very supportive audio department. While the base game of New Vegas has a tremendous amount of unused content, the DLCs have very, very little in comparison. Considering the length of their development cycle, this isn't surprising, but I asked Chris if there were any ideas he regretted not making it into the DLCs. A few, but to be honest, I don't regret it because we were taking what we'd learned from the core game, downscope when you can if it helps the overall quality, and applying it to the DLCs, and I think it helped keep a narrower focus. So, for example, originally in a holdover from Van Buren, we played around with the idea that Elijah was tracking you and communicating with you through your Pip-Boy, but it was determined that was too complicated and an interface confusion risk, so it was scrapped. Also, the original layout for Lonesome Road was more open world. Ulysses would present a series of challenges that told more about the backstory of the destroyed community and the Divide. But the art team thought we could do more impressive locations if the DLC was linear, which was true, but it wasn't as Fallouty as a result. One thing that almost didn't make it into the game was a series of narrative requests for Honest Hearts. All of the narrative elements I'd asked for, example, even Joshua Graham's one-off about Caesar and couriers as spies, turned out not to have been implemented a day before production was about to come to an end. But once I followed up and discovered it hadn't been done, we were able to include it, but it was a close thing. Honest Hearts already had very little to do with the other DLCs, so I would have felt bad if even the minor mentions, which were still important, hadn't made it in. After that, I was more careful to follow up on requests and make sure they were being tracked, rather than assuming it had been added to the schedule, which I'd prefer to simply trust folks with the task, but in this case, all the requests slipped through the cracks. Chris mentioned how Elijah was originally planned to track and communicate with the player through their Pip-Boy. Unfortunately, the dialogue intended for this concept wasn't recorded as far as I can tell, but it was at least partially written. And luckily for us, some of these lines are contained in Elijah's Bart quest. These quests trigger Elijah's dialogue as the player explores the Sierra Madre, but it appears that the quest objective tab was used as a storage location for early dialogue. The cut Casino Pip-Boy lines are essentially the same as the lines used in the final game, except some of them contain additional exposition. The town Pip-Boy dialogue, however, is very interesting, as many of the lines are unique and have no counterpart in the final DLC. Here are some of my favorites. Mitchell? That your name? Mitchell? No. Wait. Previous owner. Vault 21. Vegas. No matter. Not important. Probably stole this Pip-Boy from him, didn't you? Don't worry. If you're a thief is just what I need. There were others like you. Turned on each other, even before the collars. Play your cards right. Be smart. You'll live through this. Be dumb. Well, your head wasn't much use to you anyway. So that's what happened to that one. Pray you don't end up like him. Greed killed him. Can kill you too. Here, Elijah's talking about Dean Domino and Vera Keys and would have said, he knew a way into the starlet's room. Backstage pass indeed. He even would have provided tips to the player as they made their way through the villa. If you're trying to crawl and hide, don't turn on your Pip-Boy light. That light makes it easier for others to spot you. But by far the most interesting cut line is this one. You're resourceful. Had a daughter, foster daughter like you. She was willful, stubborn, but clever. She's gone now, lost to me. If I recall correctly, Elijah is only referred to as Veronica's mentor in the final game, So, it's an interesting artifact of development that Veronica was planned to be his foster daughter in early drafts of the script. There's more to discuss about his cut dialogue, but I'm going to save that for a future episode focusing specifically on the cut content of the DLCs. Cuts are made throughout the various stages of every game's development, but many of the games developed by Obsidian have a notable amount of cut content. Just between KOTOR 2 and New Vegas, there's enough unused content for an entire game at least. I think it's important to note that both of these games had short development cycles relative to their scope, but I asked Chris if this was exasperated by overly ambitious planning. I'd say so. KOTOR 2 was the first game we developed at Obsidian, and it was a change to go from Black Isle, where you could draw upon resources from other divisions if you needed, to being an independent studio working on a franchise owned by someone else. In fact, this transition was difficult in many respects. To explain, our management structure got flipped. Back at Black Isle, our management heads had been the one giving requests and tasking developers, and they were used to having their way because they had the leverage of milestone payments to back up their demands. However, when the situation was flipped, management got a crash course in empathy as to what it meant to be on the receiving end of demands like that. Not that the demands were unreasonable, but all the power to resist them was gone. Obsidian was living milestone to milestone, and we often couldn't afford a delay in payment. All of this caused a lot of growing pains, not all of which I think have finally settled, as it persisted from project to project. It's one of the reasons I look to the Pillars franchise as encouraging, because the less Obsidian has to deal with a publisher, I think it'll be better for them and allow their products to be more what they want to deliver, and timeliness isn't as much an issue if you're the only one paying for it. Although, arguably, no one wants to watch their company bank account drop to dangerous levels to keep a game going. Next, I inquired about the relationship between Obsidian and Bethesda during FNV's development. It was pretty typical of a publisher-developer relationship, really, and in some cases, they even helped us out in additional ways that they didn't need to do. Giving more money to improve the game's animations, for example. Also, I know the Metacritic score got a lot of press, but that clause in the contract was something they suggested in addition to the agreed-upon contract, not mandated. The fact we missed it by 1% was more the studio's fault than anyone else's. I keep thinking if we'd cut production earlier and fix more bugs, that 1% was completely achievable and would have helped prevent coming layoffs when Stormlands was canceled. It was definitely one of the least hostile relationships the studio had had, for sure. We had disagreements at times, but not at the same level as on other projects with other publishers. However, it was telling that upper management wasn't as involved with New Vegas as other projects at the time, like they had been with Sega and then Square Enix, both of which didn't go to great places and kind of ruined future opportunities. Upper management was barely involved with the DLCs beyond mandating some exposition moments. It's the reason why the openings are sometimes dialogue heavy. It's because they were worried players wouldn't understand what was going on. Also, there was a strange view from the New Vegas heads at Obsidian, was that Bethesda marketing dropped the ball on everything, which I'd have to disagree with. They were pretty on point with a lot of the direction and marketing approaches, and were definitely better than many other publishers upper management worked with. Next, I asked how working on New Vegas changed his perspective towards game design. It was further reinforcement of less is more. It reaffirmed the importance of establishing clear hierarchies and entrusting people with broader responsibilities. Also, it was a clear case, even though Obsidian knew it by this point, that releasing a game unfinished does not save you any time or effort. Not only does it hurt the studio's reputation, but that time will eventually have to be paid back, and it's better to finish a game versus postponing a game's completion until after its release. We lost a lot of development hours on the DLC to fixing continuing problems with the core game, and the DLCs could have been even stronger had the first game downscoped earlier. During his career, Chris has written some of my absolute favorite rivals in gaming, like Elijah, Ulysses, The Legate, The Think Tank, Kreia and KOTOR 2, and more, and each of them subverts the villain tropes typically seen in most media. I asked Chris about his process for writing such consistently engaging rivals. Aw, you said rivals. I'm seriously touched. That's great, and I appreciate it. For me, villains are best when they're just allies you haven't out-debated / outmaneuvered yet. So, you've captured the first point in your question. Making a rival can often be more interesting than a straight-up antagonist or villain. The next thing to consider is how the rival / antagonist / foil provides a perspective on the theme of the game, if there is one, including game mechanics. Ulysses focuses on faction politics, Kreia focuses on questioning the Force and predestination, etc., etc. Also, it's good if the opponent has a philosophy, because in my mind, it's one thing to beat a villain in combat through sheer force, but if you can out-debate him, or show proof of why their philosophy is flawed, like the Master in Fallout 1, I think that's a much better and more satisfying victory than simply pounding someone into the dirt or filling them full of bullet holes. There's other points to villain construction, but the last thing to consider with building a game antagonist is the more their actions are focused on the player versus some nebulous outside goal, the better. The player should fit into the villain's worldview and be someone they regard as a threat or a challenge as well. They don't have to start out believing that way, it can happen over time, but it makes the player feel more a part of the world and more an important part of the world if the rival / villain / antagonist sees them as a threat or key to their goal / worldview. It's why Ulysses focuses on the player as a courier and as a rival courier. It's why Kreia hunts the exile. It's why the think tank is obsessed with your brain, etc. Every Fallout game has had differing themes, tone, and even gameplay mechanics, ranging from isometric turn-based strategy to first-person action RPG. Fallout was even designed as a spiritual successor to the 1988 PC game Wasteland, due to Interplay not having the rights to make Wasteland 2. Fans have been drawn to the series for a plethora of reasons, while various developers have had conflicting perspectives as to how Fallout should appear. As someone responsible for many of the series' best moments, I asked Chris what he believed are the essential components that makes a Fallout game Fallout. You were kind, but I don't feel I made many of the moments people appreciate, but thank you anyway. So here's what I think makes a Fallout game a Fallout game. Archetypes and quest solutions. Combat Boy, Stealth Boy, Speech Boy. Each of these archetypes can solve a quest, and ideally solve the game in completely different ways, clearly different from the others. The 1950s vision, the idea that the technology and the feel of the world and tech is what people in the 1950s imagined the future to be like, I think has always been the visual cue that sets the world apart. The Vault Boy is now an icon many people recognize, and with good reason. You can roleplay, you can be evil, and it matters. You can be good, and it matters. The factions you join and the reputations you create matter. The consequences are in the game, and they're part of the core narrative design. Not all RPGs have this level of commitment to these ideals, but Fallout does a great job because that was the vision from the outset. This is a minor point, and while not necessarily key to the franchise, I always felt the way interactions and dialogues with NPCs were done, so your attributes, skills, faction allegiance, and karma could create new dialogue options or close off others, was brilliant. The first time I experienced that design mechanic in Fallout 1, it completely changed how I viewed RPG dialogue interactions, and it made Planescape Torment's dialogues even better for it once I'd finished my work on Fallout 2, and then immediately went to working on finishing Torment. Next, I ask what it's like to have been such an integral part of a game series that's so revered and has maintained such a large, devout fan base. It's very gratifying. I still kick myself to this day about not taking the opportunity to work on Fallout 1 when Tim Kaine asked, but being able to work on Fallout 2, Van Buren, even if it didn't get released, and New Vegas was wonderful. Fallout's a great franchise, and I enjoy designing for it very much. Next, I inquired what projects he was currently working on. A few. Pathfinder Kingmaker is about to be launched September 25th. I finished Into the Breach from the makers of FTL earlier this year, and I'm currently working with Techland on Dying Light 2, and also with Ken Levine and Ghost Story on an unannounced project that I'm very excited about. There's a few other projects as well, but nothing I can go into at this time, unfortunately. But I can't wait until they're announced. I think RPG fans will be very, very happy at the news. Nearing the end of our interview, Chris provided addendums on 2 quotes from my talk with J.R. Vosvik. Back in episode 6, I asked J.R. Vosvik about New Vegas' crunch, and he replied with this quote. As for crunch, I don't remember it being too terrible, and I had definitely been on far worse at other companies. Obsidian was cool about staff dedicating what time they could, but nothing mandatory. It was after F&V that I decided I wouldn't crunch on games anymore, and just make the time spent as productive as possible. Chris expanded on this, saying, he is correct. It is a clear sign of poor management, and before one decides to target the publisher, I will say it is not something a publisher is necessarily to blame for. Sometimes a game like New Vegas has many more features and content than it needs for all the wrong reasons. I think there may have been 1 or 2 times when a publisher asked us to put in a weekend during New Vegas. All the long hours largely came from internal request. As for more features and content, sometimes you should take a step back and ask if something really needs to be in the game if you could get a month or 2 back to fix bugs. And also not get any bugs related to the content you're cutting as well. For example, if someone told me I could have gotten more programming resources for narrative scripting if the ammo bench and caravan had been flushed down the shitter in favor of making the overall game experience better, I would have said, are we still talking about this? Yes. Finally, Chris replied to one of JR's memories from New Vegas' development, which I'll quickly recount here for reference. Early on, I was sharing an office with Eric Fenstermaker. After a week or 2 of writing, he checked in some dialogue and was super happy with it, and he had written several hundred lines. At that point, I had only written about a dozen placeholders. A bit later, he starts swearing and sort of fake sad crying laughing and is looking defeated. Being the glowing tower of empathy that I am, I told him to shut the F up, but also inquired why he was now a broken shell of a man. He told me he checked in a couple hundred lines for a character, and then checked Chris Avellone's character for comparison. Over 10,000 lines, legend status confirmed. So that experience really opened my eyes to the metrics required to reach exalted levels of awesome. Here I was with 10 to 20 lines, Finster, who was one of our best, with hundreds, then Chris, amazing. It was long after that I read a great book called War of Art. Check it out. To summarize, work a 10 to 6 day every day and put in the work. It will come. Chris expanded on this as well, saying, so chipping away at a task is definitely something to do. Sometimes just focusing on a small part each day and taking pride in getting that done is a plus. For example, I might decide, hey, today I'll write all of Ulysses' voice set, or his opening intro, or set up his audition sheet, or build his inventory items, set his skills, etc. I honestly don't remember how many lines or kept lines were in some dialogues. The other takeaway here, however, is that it's never quantity, it's the quality of what you do that's important. For me, when I hear games bragging about word count, it doesn't impress me. It makes me wonder if they hired an editor, and if they really needed to write half the words they did. This was a huge problem on Pillars of Eternity. There were walls of exposition text for many NPCs, and worse, it often wasn't relevant exposition, it was just rambling. In any event, that's kind of JR to notice, and he's right about the do a little every day. It helps in other ways because you don't beat yourself up that you didn't write 100 lines. You acknowledge that you did a great job on the Stage 1 quest text in only 25 lines, and that you got the quest scripting flags in. The other 75 lines can be rationed out and done in subsequent days. Take pride in what you accomplish on a day-to-day basis, and nothing's worse than being so paralyzed by a task that you do nothing at all. If you sit all day staring at the screen, it's not going to change unless you push your hands to do some typing, and even if you're not happy with it, you'll still have learned you're not happy with what you wrote, and you can put it in the discard pile and focus on other options that can work now that you've gotten a crappy one out of the way. And that's all for this episode. I found Chris's perspective on narrative design outright fascinating, and his insight not only into Fallout New Vegas, but the Fallout series as a whole was enlightening. Not just that, but Chris has a blunt honesty about the games he's worked on, which I found very refreshing. During his career, Chris has created some of my absolute favorite characters, concepts, and locations in many of my favorite games, and having the chance to not only talk with him, but ask him questions I've been dying to ask for years was a genuine honor and completely surreal for me. So Chris, thank you so much, and thanks again to J.R. Vosvik for making all of this happen. As always, thanks for watching, and like and subscribe for more content like this.